So, comrades, I think first of all, thanks so much everyone for coming. I think it's hectic schedules for everyone right now, juggling a million things. So to take the time to spend a day or 2 days, as we did with some of the comrades that joined yesterday, it's a big commitment. So we really appreciate that. Not least given the context of COVID, where coming in and having a face-to-face meeting is an even bigger commitment. We leave our families, it's precarious. So I think it's in light of that that we'll also ask everyone to keep masks up all the time as best possible. There's sanitizers here, and so that we can make sure that we're all safe and that we go back to our families safely as well. So that's the first thing. But I think it's the COVID situation also highlights a bigger problem, right? It highlights the problem of needing more public resources to pay for healthcare, which the pandemic has put the spotlight on, is much needed. We need more housing, we need more education. But we've also seen growing levels of inequality and the pandemic being used as a means of restructuring the global economy. So as much as everyone is talking about a just recovery from the transition, what we see being implemented in South Africa and globally are some of the harshest austerity measures in a very long time. In South Africa, over the past year and a half, we've seen the biggest cuts to the budget in post-apartheid South Africa. And these are cuts to social spending, to infrastructure, municipal infrastructure, transport, housing, human settlements, as well as massive cuts to the public sector wage bill, which, as we've discussed yesterday, is going to massively reduce the level of public sector workers, which leaves more and more people stranded. So it's in this context, of course, that the question of profit shifting, wage evasion, and illicit financial flows becomes even more pertinent as a means of raising the resources to finance economy that puts the needs of the people and the planet first, so that we can finance an economy that tackles growing levels of inequality, so that we can finance an economy that places and prioritizes public services at the center of whatever we do going forward. Not least in the context of the crisis of our times, the ecological crisis, which in and of itself is going to take a huge amount of resources to be able to avert an ecological catastrophe. So there's a huge amount of reasons for us to locate the problem of profit shifting within the context of a just recovery from the pandemic. And it's in light of this that many people are quite enthusiastic around new proposals that have been unfolding globally. There's been the OECD BEPS action plan. Following on from that, we see G7 countries making a proposal for a tax deal that supposedly is aiming to combat the problem of illicit financial flows, base erosion, and profit shifting, or as we prefer to call profit shifting and wage evasion. And some of this, why we do this, will be illuminated upon throughout the course of the day. So I think there's, at the same time, lots of skepticism, though, that these proposals don't deal with the problem, especially for developing countries, countries that have massive mining industries and extractivism. And these are obviously problems that contribute significantly to the ecological crisis. So I think it's in this context that we're hoping to have this discussion today, but also to look at more specifically, what are the proposals being forwarded at the global level? What's the state of play in terms of tax reforms? And what are the critiques and the perspectives that some of us have been making of the current unfolding propositions from a developing country perspective, and especially from an African country perspective. But then there's also been some very concrete developments in South Africa. We're very fortunate to have a whistleblower with us here, and with the support of a whistleblower over some time, AIDC, AMCU, and Richard Spoor Incorporated, they've tried to take up a case against a corporation. And we would like to talk a little bit about this and other cases that we've investigated that really sheds light on how these corporations are allegedly involved in unlawful transactions. And then I think the big question is, what do we do about it? What are the next steps? What can this conference agree upon as we go forward in the coming period? So I think that's a bit of context to why we brought you here, and to thank you for all coming, and also to give a sense of what we hope to achieve by being here over the course of the day. We've had some apologies. Some people have fallen ill. So for example, Sam Hargreaves, who was meant to be on the panel today, won't be able to join us. And I think it's better that when people are feeling unwell, that they stay home, so that I think it protects the rest of us as well. So on that note, comrades, welcome and thank you. We're looking forward to lots of engagement and discussion. And I think that as we go and talk and discuss, we'll ask people to introduce themselves, where they are, and before they intervene. Welcome to the comrades who have joined us virtually. We hope that you will also find the discussions fruitful and find ways to engage either through the chat, or we can find ways of feeding you through the audio as well. So on that note, comrades, and without further ado, I think we move into the first panel discussion, where we will ask Patrick Bond to further contextualize the issue of illicit financial flows, to provide a broader political economy perspective within which we can locate the rest of the discussion. Patrick, are you ready? Patrick will speak for 30 minutes, after which we'll open it up for discussion.
Amandla! Amandla! Dear comrades, I'm Patrick, and I'm teaching at University of Johannesburg Department of Sociology starting this month, and I'm so happy to be with dear allies here. What I was asked to do is give context, but you know, I've lived on and off in this city since 1990. So when we have visitors to Johannesburg, we warn them about one serious problem: crime. It's bad here. It's bad in this neighborhood. You think you're safe. But do you know that just down the road is where the landlords committed unprecedented crimes against humanity? And their younger sons and grandsons and great-grandsons continue. They are now considered, if you can see our slides, the Sunday Times, we don't normally trust everything, but this is actually correct, that the capitalist class are world fraud champs. 8 out of 10 managers commit economic crime. The rot starts at the top. You know that from what AIDC, working with the trade unions, did, especially AMCU, to unveil the base erosion and profit shifting, BEPS, if some of you haven't heard that acronym, at Longman. Longman was a company that the British Conservative Prime Minister, you remember his name? Edward Heath. He called that the unacceptable face of capitalism. And that's the company, Longman, which our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, decided to become the #2 investor in, over 9%, and the main local South African investor. And when it came to his company, Shanduka, which owned a part of it, in Kwaba, it came to deciding should they continue their base erosion and profit shifting to Bermuda, something that AIDC, comrades, and AMCU had helped to unveil with some other economists. It was very revealing that Cyril Ramaphosa's company was the one saying to Longman, keep the arrangement going, right? So we have from the white bourgeoisie a lack of patriotism. I'll illustrate that. And they've drawn in, the Zwelinzima Vavi call this the Irish coffee problem. Who's had an Irish coffee? What do you have? A large black mass of coffee. That's delicious. And then white cream, and you sprinkle a little bit maybe of cinnamon or chocolate on top. And that phenomenon, sprinkling about 5 or 6 billionaires on top, means that the political economy of profit shifting is seamless from the racial apartheid to the class apartheid eras. And I just drove here along this very road, this one here, and I drove by one of the main criminal sites, KPMG, the accounting firm that codifies and turns a blind eye and takes what is illicit financial flows and tries its best. Sometimes it's a little sloppy and it makes, very obvious errors, and some of their, managers, their account reps have to get fired, but they try to turn illicit to licit. In other words, to make legal some of the ways that you saw with the Pandora papers. We have illicit. So we'll go into that, but I do want to warn you, if you're in this part of town, you think it's only Santon that might be a problem area. Just about half a K down the road is a place called Brenthurst. So just to kick off the political economy side of things, be very careful if you're walking out on the streets near Brenthurst, because the political economy of the Brenthurst Foundation is to loot Africa. And they have extremely good people like Greg Mills. He's a very effective, let's say, ideologue of the Brenthurst ideology. Who was it that founded Brenthurst? What is this Brenthurst? It's a big estate, just half a K down the road, on the same road. Does anybody know about this Brenthurst? Which family? Oppenheimer. So there was a Brenthurst group that helped Nelson Mandela pick the finance minister to replace the white guys, Chris Liebenberg, precisely in 1996. The Brenthurst group, led at that time by the older Oppenheimer, now it's Nicky Oppenheimer, but they've left their foundation in charge with Greg Mills, and next to him you see a leading British imperialist, Dickie Davis, and you see Olusegun Obasanjo, the former Nigerian leader, right? And there you get the ideology. We want more international trade and capital, not aid. We want more enterprise. We want private sector growth, not public sector redistribution. So I think this is part of our political economy, and we see it if we take just a moment to remember that 1 year and 4 days ago, one of our leaders in Somkhele in northern KwaZulu-Natal was assassinated in front of her grandchildren. So a moment for Fikile Nchingazi, long live her spirit. There were protests on Friday at the police station because a year later, still nothing. No hint of who assassinated her, but we're pretty sure it was an associate, 3 associates of Tendele, which is a coal mine that's been doing a lot of offshore financing, moving a huge amount of its profitability to a place called Ohio, Ashtabula, Ohio, to build a new factory, $475 million worth. But critically for our purposes, as we think about the legacy and what her struggle, many of you involved in the anti-mining, anti-extractivist struggles, you'll sympathize. What her struggle teaches us in a place like the old KwaZulu Bantustan, where women especially were put, and their men were brought to do migrant labor in Durban or Richards Bay, closer by. The lack of an organic capitalist economy in these Bantustan areas, and our failure to get a just transition so we can get out of this filthy coal mining, which is ruining our climate, and into a genuine wage-led bottom-up recovery that's anti-extractivist. We failed so far. And this is what our activists are beginning to wake up to in a place like Somkhele, that coal kills. And one reason coal kills is we're understanding that there's a climate, not just local ecology, local assassination, local social disruption, when you have a coal mine that just takes over your villages. But also there's global, isn't there? So we're now beginning to measure this more effectively. One of the great crimes, I think, is that the damage done by those of us with high carbon footprints, I'm one, because I was frequent flying, right, to my conferences. And people like me in this country, the corporations, we have a climate debt. Now, how high is it? Well, if you ask Donald Trump, the answer is, oh, it's about $1 per ton. If you put a ton of emissions that are called greenhouse gases, which is mainly carbon dioxide and methane, if you put that into the atmosphere, it's going to do $1, 15 rand of damage. And then Joe Biden says, no, it's more, it's $51. But the latest research, in fact, shows that the social cost of carbon, the way we measure damage of the climate crisis, is $3,000 a ton, which should just stop much of our extractive industries based on mining and smelting and compel us to move quickly in a just transition because of the money we should be saving. If we really had to do a polluter pays, we'd have to pay the damage done by our polluting. And I conclude myself as someone with a high carbon footprint, it would be unaffordable. It's desperately needed to take million climate jobs, as the AIDC have done, or the Climate Justice Coalition, with 350.org, SAFTU, and many other groups, or the Climate Justice Charter, and really move that quickly, because this damage is a crime, because there are scofflaws, people who aren't paying their climate debt. Now, this one is easy, because he didn't even believe in the climate crisis. He's just blind, or so attuned to the military-industrial complex, the extractive industries, the fossil fuel industries, that this one said, no, there's no climate crisis, it's a Chinese invention. You heard that man, right? I won't say his dirty name. But there's a worse problem, which is liberalism, which has taken over, which preceded this man. And here's an example, a man called Todd Stern. He was the main manager of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Polluters. What? What's that? The COPs, right? Are we having one soon? Yes. Later this week it begins in Glasgow, Scotland. COP26. We had one in Durban in 2011. And what this man says is very revealing, because he acknowledges that there is climate crisis. He even acknowledges we recognize our historic role as Yankees. He's State Department top negotiator, really managed the UNFCCC. We acknowledge our role, but the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I categorically reject that. Okay, so you get a good sense of the arrogance of Yankee power. I did my PhD studies there. It is very revealing to look at what is that climate debt? How much do those guys owe? Well, the Yankees owe about a fifth of the 2.5 trillion tons of CO2 that are in the atmosphere. It takes a couple hundred years for it to dissolve. So this is serious. It's with us still today. And we think reparations are due from the US and the other imperialist powers. Some of them you know, Germany, the UK, Japan, Canada, those are the big five. But listen, there's also sub-imperialist powers. China and Russia, now exploring in Antarctica for fuel, they just announced today, and Brazil and India and South Africa, along with a few others like Indonesia. But the BRICS particularly could be seen, minus Vladimir Putin, in this room, which was critical to the way the criminality of Western imperial plus BRICS sub-imperial climate policy, including default on the debt, occurred. It was December 2009. It was in Copenhagen for one of these conferences of the polluters, an unambitious, non-binding deal. No penalties for default or withdrawal. You remember the US withdrew in 2017. We should have penalties, punishments. There was nothing. We should have had sanctions on them. So this was the league of super polluters who blew up the UN, according to Bill McKibben. Now, if we look at the current news, just a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, we learned that the Financial Action Task Force, finally, from a 2019 study, has now released its critique of our state. We know our state is awful on climate and under the thumb, not just Gwedimantash, not just Ramaphosa, coal mining tycoon from Shanduka, but basically under the thumb of financial capital, which means weak, dirty money controls. And as the FATF, which is an international expert body looked at our regulatory capacity, they found that the main domestic money laundering crime threats are consistently underestimated. Understanding of terrorist financing is underdeveloped and uneven. The threats from from money laundering are misunderstood. South Africa suffered from a sustained period of state capture. And the implication is that two agencies that we normally think of as being strong, standing up to state capture, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, are in fact exceptionally weak. It's interesting because for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been teaching in schools of government, one across the way. It's also, I've just come from UWC. School of Government. My students are always worried because they're understood by their peers as bureaucrats in training to be corrupt. And I would say, if we are training them at places like Pitt School of Governance or UWC, we're not doing a very good job, because our 2020 rankings, Transparency International, the main ranking agency for state corruption, politicians and bureaucrats, puts us at 110th most corrupt. If, on the other hand, you just go next door to the Wits School of Governance, you go to the Wits Business School, then you find that we are number 2 in training in the world, tied with China, behind India, for corrupt businesses, for economic crime. Now, don't take this from me. I'm a Marxist. Of course, I would say that. But PwC has a rating every 2 years. Do you know about PwC? Is it an extremely corrupt company? It is. I trust them. It takes one to know one, right? So they do these surveys every 2 years of economic crime. And one of their Johannesburg officials acknowledges that bribery and corruption are the most serious economic crime to affect business, and increased involvement of senior management in perpetrating such acts has resulted in a sharp increase in the value of losses. And the level of involvement in senior management as the main perpetrator has escalated from 20 to 34%. So this is really from the top down in these criminal sites where you really must watch your wallets. Sandton, Stellenbosch, Umhlanga, Central Cape Town, 8 out of 10 managers commit crime. We're the world leader in money laundering, bribery and corruption, procurement fraud, asset misappropriation, and cyber crime. How many of you are proudly South African? Gold medalists for 15 years in a row, until last year we came in number 2, tied with China, behind India. But really, this is an exceptional record. Now, if you're reading the newspapers, I'm showing you a few headlines that confirm what I'm saying. This is not my little Marxist fantasy, is it? But it's something that is not understood, is it? How many of you knew that our bourgeoisie is the world-class leader in economic crime? Did anybody know that? Really, we should, shouldn't we? Because they are world-class, but our bureaucrats and our politicians are pretty damn mediocre, if you ask me. Don't ask me, ask Transparency International. 110th most corrupt compared to the bourgeoisie in Sandton and Umhlanga, in Stellenbosch, and Central Cape Town. And they are applauded and encouraged by the Big Four. Steinhoff, audited by Deloitte. VBS, audited by KPMG. SAA, audited by PwC. Tonga Hewlett, audited by Deloitte. Eskom with Deloitte. SARS, destroyed by KPMG, right? So we do have world-class, let me call them secret state agencies, the accounting firms that are always behind the scenes, egging on, codifying, affirming our corporate criminality. What an extraordinary conflation, right? When you hear about corporate governance, I would just snicker, because the procurement system, according to an insider named Kenneth Brown, who had to quit because of assassination threats 3 years ago, but he revealed that out of every Treasury procurement contract, that he was looking through them all, right, 35 to 40% overcharging was the norm. On average, that's 200 and what was it, out of a 600 billion rand budget, around 200 billion a year, and of course it's escalated since that point. How bad is it? The anti-money laundering measures that were looked at 3 years ago, or in fact it was October 2019, showed that we had 10 to 25% of Africa's 100 billion in illicit financial flows. This is 3 to 7% of the economy. Now, these are what the official figures are providing. What we really don't know is how serious this problem is, but we begin to find out. Although, as far as I could tell, the Pandora papers that were just released don't have too many obvious fingerprints of South Africans. The Paradise papers certainly did in 2017. And again, it was Shanduka with its Mauritian deal-making in Mozambique, MTN under the chair of Cyril Ramaphosa. We could talk for ages about what they do in Nigeria, Uganda, all over Africa, as well as in the Middle East, where massive scandals have hit them in Iran and Afghanistan. And I've already mentioned the fingerprints on lawmen. Now, these were studied as a general problem by ex-President Mbeki for the African Union. You remember the high-level panel on illicit financial flows. And this was one of the reasons that really good groups like Stop the Bleeding got going. In fact, the Secretary General of the Economic Commission on Africa has said we might be looking at $148 billion. And you can see from the data, and I'll share all these slides if you like, it just gets worse and worse and worse. One of our own studies that I was working with Khadija Sharif and Sarah Bracking on about 7 or 8 years ago, looked at just one company, De Beers, and found $2.83 billion worth of the mispricing. And of course, AIDCs, we've already gone through, I assume, the Amplats, Impala, and Lonmin extraction, which meant that workers couldn't get paid that $12,500 living wage that they needed. And then from our own Financial Intelligence Center, which is an agency more or less within the Treasury, massive increases in suspicious and unusual transaction reporting. So I'll send you all of that report. But what it means is that this boundary between illicit and licit is also becoming very gray. It's a gray area if you've got very good criminal lawyers, corporate lawyers in Santon, who help you take what was and is, in anybody's reading, illicit, a mispricing, a tax dodge, and make it licit, make it appear more legal. And the real damage is in our balance of payments. Now, we've recently had what we call a current account surplus. That means there's been more trade surplus. So we've had exports that outweigh imports. But we've got a persistent problem with the licit financial flows, you can see in the red here, which are the flows of profits, dividends, and interest. And that's what keeps our interest rate at 9% in the international markets, third behind only Turkey and Pakistan. So then we've got all kinds of other trade fraud, and very minimum for 50 billion rand a year for the tax revenues alone, according to Dennis Davis. So that's a very conservative estimate. And we do have more and more from Global Financial Integrity, explanations, which I think you've looked at enough already in the documentary, so we won't dwell on all of the details, but they're available for you if you like. And then we come, whoops, for some reason, let's see if we can come back to, looks like a little bit of a freeze here. Do you want to ask any questions while I unfreeze, while whatever's happening is not responding? Let me just wait for the program. Any questions at this moment while the computer, I think it's rebelling against all this crime, or doesn't want to be party to it. Let's see if I can get this started one more time. We wait for it to respond. Let's just quickly take that break to see, do you need to stretch or do you need to go out and vomit? I mean, this is really revolting information. So let's have a question or two. Please say who your name and who you're with.
Sure, it's Anita Manning from SARS. The point I want to make mention is at the beginning we were talking about ecological employment. And I was appalled to learn that Africa contributes approximately 4% to global emissions, yet we are the ones facing significant prejudice, and that our glaciers, especially Mount Kilimanjaro, would be gone in 2 decades.
That's right.
Yet we're not even responsible.
Well, it's such an important area that I'd like to return to our resource extraction cursing, because that to me is one of the most awful phenomena. And One of the aspects is the climate debt. Just see if I can refine this particular slide here, just before we get to what I think Samantha Hargraves would, she's mandated me to say, a few more gory details about all of this. But I definitely want to endorse this concern you have, here's where I stop, that the climate crisis is not done by, I think we can go ahead here, yeah, this is coming through, is not caused by Africa, but what we've seen so far is that, especially next door in Mozambique, where they've created probably the very lowest amount of CO2 per person, because it's a non-industrialized economy with the exception of the one aluminium smelter near Maputo. And yet, you know what happened there in 2019? You've heard of Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Kenneth, right? Cyclone Idai killed 1,400 people in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe. And that was because the Mozambique Channel, the temperature rose by 4 degrees. So it was really a massive cyclone. Cyclone Kenneth in April 2019 that hit a place called Cabo Delgado was 4 degrees higher, right? That water temperature. So these cyclones come and just gather up this heat and just dump it, right? And in the case of Kenneth, it was at 225 km per hour. I don't know if any comrades are here from Durban, but I was there right in between on Easter Monday of 2019. Anybody there for the Durban rain bomb when we were hit with 160 millimeters in 24 hours, 50% more than the prior record. 71 people dead, mostly African women and children. Do you remember any of that, the Durban rain bomb? Some of you were worried at the time, if you're from Cape Town, of the impending droughts. Well, the near day zero in 2018, the droughts that were hitting Western Cape, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape. But that Durban rain bomb was in between the two cyclones that hit Mozambique. So what are we doing now with our tax money? Are we spending 1 billion rand sending our South African National Defence Force troops to Cabo Delgado? Yes, so what are they there for? What companies are they defending? Total, ExxonMobil, Eni, the Italian oil company, China National Petroleum Corporation. Why are they defending those companies? There's a local rebellion. It has an Islamic orientation, but it's a local rebellion against basically looting. That area, Cabo Delgado, has been systematically underdeveloped. Why are those companies there? It's the 4th largest gas field in the world. So they're looking for oil and gas, right? So the insanity that we are not, as South Africans, those of us, particularly like me, who owe a huge climate debt, we're not going to pay the climate debt to the people, the victims of Cyclone Kenneth, Cyclone Idai, are we? We're going to make it worse in order for us to get Sasol and possibly a pipeline going from Cabo Delgado to Gauteng, right? This is what's underway right now. So those of you angry about South African sub-imperialism, what we do to the region, also you're worried about the blowback that our working class has xenophobic tendencies because we put so much destruction into the region, we're getting refugees, economic refugees from Zimbabwe, from the DRC, right? And in that context, for us to be doing precisely this denialism about South Africa's role in the climate crisis, and now we're putting our soldiers, our bombs and bullets, our boys and our body bags. Yeah, because body bags will start coming back, won't they? Full of our brothers, a few sisters. And when that becomes more clear, that what we're doing is defending Emmanuel Macron's favorite company, Total. He visited Ramaphosa in June to make this happen. Right? He visited Paul Kagame in Rwanda to get 1,000 of their troops there too. And that they're digging for gas, which creates more climate crisis, which means more cyclones, which means more destruction, more climate debt for us. What the heck, right? So this is the insanity that we've got without any more of these details about where all these illicit financial flows, what kind of crimes they are. Let me quickly skip, I would add to that the cyber currency scamming, and that South Africa is one of the most exposed with our rich people, our unpatriotic bourgeoisie, in taking money out of the country through Bitcoin, right? And there's all kinds of things to be said about that, but the only way I think we can really address this is to use 2 dirty words that are never used, even by our friends in the NGOs. They're scared of these 2 dirty words. May I use the words, Dominic, please? What 2 dirty words would you not expect to see from our regulators?
Capital control.
Capital controls, also called exchange controls. That is, to stop the money flowing out of the country through physically forcing the companies to actually declare. Now, there is, for all of you who might have pension funds or insurance funds, there is a restriction. 70% of that money must stay in the country. That's the residual. That's leftover. But they're gradually taking away those. The last time it was a huge outflow, 500 billion rand. Guess which finance minister in 2018 authorized this, February 2018? His name? Malusi Gigaba. Radical economic transformation. I saw that man allowing 500 billion rand from 75 to 70% regulation on export of those big institutional funds. So the hypocrisy of that RET faction is exposed, I think. Anyway, we could reduce money laundering through exchange controls. We could have genuine regulators. There you see some of the characters. Like just one example that I think you've all heard of, which is 17 banks manipulating the currency, right? And these banks have been prosecuted in the United States, in Britain. We know the names. You can tell from the names, their ethnicities, right? And they're pretty much like the rest of these Tutsis. You can basically tell them by the color of their skin. But we have one really sharp guy, Reg Nkosi, who's put out exactly how this is happening. Without time to go into all of these tricks that he goes through as to what happens in currency manipulation, what is important is the prior finance minister had a very clear posture. Blindness. He just would not look at this 17 banks, many prosecuted internationally, many having paid big fines. And he says, no, it's a big, deep and liquid currency market. And it's just the conduct of bank traders toward clients that's at stake. So we don't care about that in the state. Right? We have a competition commission looking at it. Meanwhile, some of the banks that are doing this, their executives are getting rich. And one way they're getting rich, talk about manipulation of the currency, this is called a flash crash. And it was engineered by Goldman Sachs, right? Goldman Sachs just said, let's bet against the rand. And to me, this is sickening because the man in charge of Goldman Sachs in South Africa, even in the current business day today, is feted. His name is Gareth Coleman. You see him there on the South Africa Inc. Trip, right? So this is the kind of thing where the Panama Papers were quite helpful, brought about Paradise Papers, the Appleby leaks. I haven't seen enough about the Pandora, so I don't know, but we do know about the South Africans who tucked away 30 billion in Swiss banks. We can get into any of these details. We have a wonderful big study on global governance architecture, which names South Africans, and especially the deregulatory philosophy in Treasury, the Reserve Bank, as well as the police. Now, let me very quickly shift to, with just 2 or 3 minutes left, I hope I can do justice to the feminist critique of all of this, because it's so grounded in extractivism and the patriarchal economy. So many amazing feminist political economists. Just to quickly rush through one of the key arguments, it's about what's called social reproduction. So to make South African male workers ultra cheap, I know that comrades in the trade unions are going to say, yeah, okay, that's true. The way that the apartheid capitalist system, the Brenthurst Oppenheimer empire, the way they arranged it was to make sure that women would take care of young children, so that government expenses for schools were particularly low, or creches non-existent. Maybe there was a mission school to help. Also for injured and sick workers. During apartheid, were there medical aid schemes? No, if somebody was injured on the job or sick, they were just thrown home, right? Maybe they recovered, they could come back. Who looks after them at home? The women, the wives, the children, the grannies, the mums. And also the stresses for elderly, when you get a retirement with maybe a cheap watch, a bicycle at best. So again, the woman takes on the burden of what a state or a pension would normally do during apartheid. And that was the core of migrant labor, to make South African workers the cheapest in the world and to make the companies operating in South Africa the most profitable in the world. The ecological aspects of this are obvious as well, aren't they? So I would just remind you that I think the greatest political economist we've had on the continent, who wrote the book Delinking, which should give you a sense of what we really should be doing when it comes to international finance, international mining, which is to protect ourselves from the extreme corruption and criminality. But he's also attacked a tradition which I come from, Marxism, for having As he put it, it's true, historical Marxism had passed an eraser over the analyses advanced by Marx on environment, equating to an atemporal, rational point of view of bourgeoisie. So exploitation of natural resources is something that any of you who would like to be called Marxists, or are somewhat interested in the degree to which north-south exploitation, unequal ecological exchange occurs. Samir Amin has given us a sobering challenge. So if we bring the ecological into this bigger picture of the, let's say, not just illicit financial flows, not just licit, legal, but also the extractive industries that take our natural wealth. There are many openings for you. Some of you are interested in local land, air, water. Some of you are interested in the displacement, right? Like Fikile in Chingazi was about to be displaced. That's why she was fighting Tendele mine so hard. Or the gendered violence, again, Fikile. Or any aspect of the ways in which mining comes into a community and disrupts. Migrancy. The migrant labor system didn't end with apartheid, did it? It's even gotten much worse, you could easily argue. Workplace safety and disease. The destruction of sacred sites, graves especially, common spaces. And then we saw, especially with Cyril Ramaphosa, elite formation, compradorism, where a particular leader of a mine worker union goes onto the other team and sends in an email to the police chief saying, this is not a labor dispute, it's dastardly criminal. And within 24 hours, the Marikana massacre, right? So this kind of, let me say, local agent, Bantustan elite role that Cyril Ramaphosa played for lawmen is so despicable, isn't it? And we have seen, especially in the coal industry, the tradition, we can call it pass the trash, from Anglo Coal, from Glencore, from BHP Billiton, South 32, of taking these dirty coal assets and giving them to Mike Teki, to Sariti, to Exaro, right, to July and Glovo, right? These are the pass the trash strategies of white capital. Imperial, sub-imperial, and local turf conflicts abound in extractive industries. What we call the Dutch disease, because the currency goes up too high and skews the economy, the illicit and licit flows. And I'll just very quickly close by focusing on something I hope you all start to incorporate, because if I can use a metaphor, we've talked a little bit about the other one, which is climate. If you can imagine a matron of a community, somebody that, or of a family, somebody who's really respected, usually it's the granny, and she's meant to keep the family silver, right? The historic wealth of that family, locks it up in the cupboard. Then comes the drunken nephew one day, sees that the granny's left the house, finds the key, gets into that cupboard, grabs all the family silver, goes down to the town, finds some sleazy foreigner who'll give that drunken nephew a tiny fraction of the value of that family's silver. Right? That's the whole family's wealth being sold. The drunken nephew can buy a few more bottles and does so happily, wanders back to the homestead, goes into the house, looks at the empty cupboard, and now completely drunk, vomits all over. That's mining. Of course, the granny comes and has to clean it up and says, oh, where's our family silver? Where's our natural sovereign wealth? It's all gone through the drunken nephew, the Cyril Ramaphosa's, right? Working with the sleazy foreigners like lawmen. That metaphor means that when we count GDP, what do we count? We've just counted the sale at a small fraction of the value to the foreigner. Yay, GDP is going up because we're in a commodity super cycle. Have you seen the headlines? Yay, GDP is higher, it's 5% this year. We thought it might be lower, but thank goodness the commodity prices are going up. Who's counting the vomit? Who's counting the empty cupboard? Well, we have to, because the bourgeoisie don't want us to know, do they? Do they include it in GDP? Do they include unpaid women's work in GDP? They don't. So some of you, I know comrades here in the House, including Makua, have done a good job in addressing some of these factors. But I wonder, wouldn't you like, when you're protesting the looting, here's Mark Kutafani, head of Anglo, saying, okay, $25 billion worth of our projects are being held up. The biggest gold mine in the world, La Colosa in Colombia, was canceled because of a 98% to 2% referendum against Anglo. And all over Africa, conflicts over resources are explicit. But I think what we've been able to do with lots of protests in this continent. What was happening in Sudan the last couple of days? A coup's happened, and the people are out in the streets protesting. We've seen that across the continent. Critics of bad capitalism, bad armies, malgovernance and corruption have come up, and African protests have gone all over without time to go through all of the extraordinary stories across the continent. A great deal of them are related to the malgovernance and especially to the looting. And women, this group that Samantha represents, is really right there for many of them, with women at the core of these micro struggles that are grounded. Now, if I very quickly end by saying, what are some of the ways that we could strengthen the critique of this, let's say, natural capital depletion, or the depletion of the family silver that's just been taken away? Unfortunately, many of our activists, without having time to go through my grievances and complaints about Publish What You Pay, or Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or even my dear comrades who work in the alternative mining Indaba, or the groups here, including Global Justice Now, they are too also forgetting this, right? They're also forgetting this depletion of our wealth. So I'll just conclude by saying how serious it is to figure out the depleted wealth for future generations. Now, again, it's where Samantha would be particularly useful, because who thinks more about future generations and their welfare? About the children, right? The beautiful child here. Okay, it's not my gender, is it? Men aren't so good at thinking ahead, right? Where short-term, we're looking at immediate gratification. So women are thinking about future generations. And this particular woman, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who ran the Brundtland Commission, was actually very eloquent about how today's decision makers will be dead before the planet feels the results of acid precipitation and global warming, desertification. There are some who'd like to measure this. I'd like to join them because I think it is very vital. Here's one who quit the World Bank. His name's Herman Daly, sort of the guru of environmental economics. And he was very clear to say, let's make sure we understand the looting of the African continent. 88% of our countries have net negative wealth because of mining, because of the fossil fuels extraction. And there was even a Gaborone declaration. So I'm leaving you with, I hope, this new weapon, a weapon against the extractive industries that says, you're taking our family silver and we're getting the drunk nephew phenomenon as a result, right? How bad is it? Without all the details, you can see sub-Saharan Africa compared to the rest of the world, utterly looted. 3% of GDP a year, at least $100 billion a year. And per person, the worst year, $213, that's about 3,000 Rand worth. So without going into all of the gory details, take it from me, South Africa is one of the worst. You can look at our own natural capital accounts. I'll end there because I know I'm overwhelmed with numbers. That's what, you know, pointy-headed intellectuals are notorious for. But I hope the basic message is clear. We're here to try to figure out why illicit financial flows have to be stopped. The criminals like MTN, Longman, Shanduka, under the leadership of Cyril Ramaphosa, they have to be stopped. This is an unpatriotic bourgeoisie. But secondly, there's licit, there's legal outflows, profits, dividends, and interest. Let's put exchange controls on and stop that. It's not that radical. It's what John Maynard Keynes, the capitalist economist, always insisted. You must have capital controls. Exchange controls must be tightened. Our unpatriotic African National Congress bureaucrats and politicians are always for loosening those controls. We must stop them. And third, let's stop the extractivism that represents the decline in our wealth, right? The depletion of non-renewable resources. Our children's inheritance. We're leaving them an empty cupboard and the smell of dried vomit. We can do better. Thank you, comrades.